everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to today's Publishing Conversations panel, organized as part of Kinect's Book Factory's newsletters, 4th edition. Our topic of the day is building pathways to nurture writers. And it could not be more timely or important. Writers are the heart of our literary ecosystem, and nurturing their talent is key to ensuring the growth of the publishing industry across Africa. Now, this session is an opportunity to explore how institutions can play a vital role in supporting writers, from identifying emerging talent to creating sustainable ecosystems that enable them to thrive. We're privileged to have an incredible lineup of panelists today who bring a wealth of experience and diverse perspectives to the conversation. And your insights will be undoubtedly shed light on practical strategies and opportunities to empower writers across the continent. So before we begin, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's session, Temitayo Olofinloa. She's an award-winning writer and editor. She has worked with many publishing houses in Africa and the UK, as well as the Global Press Institute, Mania Magazine, Saraba Magazine, and Facebook, to mention a few. Her work has been featured in various publications, online and in print. She is currently the founder and creative director of Stories Click, a UK-based content studio that uses words and pictures to tell stories that resonate. She's based in Birmingham, UK. So with Temitayo leading the discussion, I'm just going to hand over and say thank you again for today's conversation.
Thank you so much, Osas. Glad to be here.
Welcome.
Happy to be here with all the amazing panelists. We'll be talking about what it means to nurture literary talent on the continent, and it's interesting the array of panelists that we've got here. Because I feel like that background, people who are creatives in the industry, also working to nurture the industry, is quite important. So thank you all for joining us. I will start by reading some of the bios of the people today. We have Troy Onyango with us. We have Oyindamola Shola and Leila Mohammed. I'll start with Troy. Troy is the founder and editor-in-chief of Loway. He's a writer and editor from Kisumu, based in the UK. His work has appeared in Parish Shuna, Doug, Wasafiri, Isele Magazine, Johannesburg Review of Books, Nairobi Noir, and more. Winner of the Nyanza Literary Festival Prize and first runner-up of the Black Letter Media Competition, he has also been shortlisted for the Kane Prize, Short Story Day Africa Prize, Brito Paper Awards, and nominated for the Pushcart Prize. His debut short story collection, For What Are Butterflies Without Wings, was published in 2022. An alumnus of multiple workshops, including the Kane Prize and Miles Moreland workshops, Troy has been a writer in residence at the Ebedi Writers Residency in Nigeria. He holds a Bachelor of Laws from the University of Nairobi, an MA in Creative Writing distinction from the University of East Anglia, and an MA in African Studies from SOAS University of London. Glad to have you here, Troy. I'll let Oyindamola go through our bio for us briefly.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Oyindamola Shola. I am the author of Face Me, I Face You, the co-founder of Spring, which is a nonprofit dedicated to empowering developing African writers. And I'm the programs director at the Poetry Journal, which is dedicated to discovering wildly relatable African stories. I received my bachelor's degree in organizational behavior and change at NYU and graduated with my master's degree at the American University. And I'm very excited to be here speaking with these wonderful leaders in the literary space.
Thank you so much, Oyindamola. Welcome. I'll quickly read Leila's bio. Leila is an editor at Cassava Republic Press. She studied law at Oxford University and has been a panelist at Africa Writes and the Black British Book Festival. Leila edits across fiction and nonfiction, including A Small Silence by Jumoke Verisimo, which was shortlisted for the RSL Ondaatje Prize 2020, and An Unusual Grief by Yewande Omotosho, which was shortlisted for the 2023 Sunday Times Fiction Prize. She has written about race and colonialism on online platforms. Welcome, Leila. I'll start with a general background of the kind of world many writers on the continent grow up in. We grow up in a space where writing is seen as a hobby and is not something that is seen as a career. You can't make something out of it. It's just something you do on the side. And I think that attitude sort of runs through many institutions. So in this day and age, what would you have to say about the role that institutions play in nurturing creative talent, in nurturing creativity, especially I'll start with you, Roy, because you started Loway as a writer yourself and as an editor, and you also have your bookshop. So you intersect across the sector, across the ecosystem in an interesting way. So I would like you to talk about that, the critical role that institutions play in nurturing creative talent.
First of all, thank you so much, KNEX, for having us for this conversation. And thank you, Temitayo, for agreeing to moderate this. And thank you, Leila and Oyindamola, for being part of this. So I always say the way I build what if we can call them institutions, because I still don't feel like we've gotten to that point where we can call them institutions. A lot of them are still happy experiments. When we look at institutions, I kind of think of, the New Yorker that has been there for 100 years or something like that. And I kind of always wish that within the African literary ecosystem, everything we build will last that long. But I was having a conversation with a friend the other day, and we can rarely find literary institutions in Africa that have lasted more than 20 years. Like, to think that there are very few institutions currently on the continent that are actively working that have lasted more than 20 years. I mean, Cassava Republic is probably one of the long-standing ones, but you can count across the continent how many there are. And so when I was setting up Lolwe, the idea of long-standing or longevity or something, I have no idea how to pronounce that word, but like this idea of something that goes beyond me, something that lives beyond me, was very much ingrained into it. And I kind of remember looking around and thinking, well, we have Chimurenga and we have Bakwa and we have Saraba. How do I build something around the template that these institutions have already created? And how do I use that then to bring writers? And for me, I don't know why people emphasize on young writers, but for me, it's just a question of writers. There are people who they're in their 50s and they're publishing their first short story, and there are people who are in their 60s and they're publishing their first novel. And so for me, it's just an emphasis on African writers and how do we bring them into the fold. And that's kind of how everything has ended up, even with the bookstore, it was just a question of, well, there's very few spaces that are focusing on African literature, on Caribbean literature. How do I create those spaces? So it's kind of always been just responding to necessity rather than sitting down and saying, oh, I must have a literary magazine. I don't have to have a literary magazine. I don't have to have a bookshop. But when I look around and these things are not there, or when they're there, they're not as supported or as well organized as I wish they could, then I kind of respond to that by saying, well, I'm going to do this and see how it goes.
Thank you so much for that. That question also sort of applies to you, Oyindamola, with your work at Spring. You have these remarkable mentorship sessions where you pair relatively more established writers with writers who are trying to figure out the space. How has that been for you?
So first, I should say thank you, Troy, for nailing the point on the head with your response. There is this proverb I once heard that a society grows when people plant trees in shades that they may never sit. We don't have that in the literary space, at least for now. Like you said, a lot of the so-called institutions or programs or opportunities are relatively new compared to other industries. Another example, which ties to part of why we started the Spring Writing Fellowship, is that in Nigeria, at least as of last year, there is no MFA in Creative Writing program. In Liberia, there isn't. In South Africa, I think there are about 8. In the US alone, there is over 220 MFA programs. And so when we think of institutions, it kind of doesn't exist in the African literary space for writers. And to tie back to what you said at the beginning, when you mentioned, Timothy, when you mentioned that writing is seen as this hobby, I remember doing research last year relating to just opportunities for African writers and realizing that it does make sense why people will stereotypically think that writing is an hobby when there is literally no MFA program. Like there are advanced degree programs for other so-called serious majors or serious career paths. So when we started the Spring Writing Fellowship, this was in 2018, our perspective was that, of course, we can't just barge into a university and say, create an MFA program or create a specific creative writing program, but we can create kind of a simulative experience where they get to know what studying writing in a specific genre intensively is like. When we started the Spring Writing Fellowship in 2016, we had, I think it was 25 applications and accepted 10 fellows. And fast forward to last year, 2024, we got over 1,700 applications. We accepted 94 fellows and 88 of them graduated from the program. And we pair them individually with mentors. So they get that one-on-one peer mentorship that they would otherwise have had at an MFA program, or let's say working with a thesis advisor to finish working on a body of work. So there is a lot of work to do. And I'm very proud of organizations that are brave enough to start it when there are no resource or guidelines for them to follow, or pathways for them to follow as an example of how to do their work. Many of us are just figuring it out as we go, and we're making progress so far.
I really liked that analogy that you said about planting a tree that you likely wouldn't sit under the shade. And I will use that to segue into the conversation about publishing houses like Cassava Republic and the work you do with creating pathways that nurture creative talents. Do you want to talk about that a little bit, Leila, about some of the initiatives, collaborations that Cassava has had in the past? Because I know that last year there was a non-fiction training of some sort. There was also a fiction one towards discovering certain types of writing from the continent. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So first of all, thank you for having me for this panel. And I want to echo Oyindamola. So you and Troy and Oyindamola gave very I think powerful answers about the reason of institution building. And that's something that we take very seriously at Cassava Republic. So I found our founder, Bibi Bakari Yusuf, always talks about this concept of the archive of the future, and how right now, what we think of as African literature, we have this shorter history of it. A lot of that is determined by outside factors, but what we see in the archive of the future is something that's been deliberately put in today. So that institution building is something that we can't just assume will happen organically. It's something we have to actively be curating and building. And as a publishing company, that's kind of what we feel our responsibility is. So what kind of books do we feel need to be in that canon in the future? What is missing? Where are these gaps? And identifying them and then actively trying to fill those gaps with our initiatives. So I think last year particularly, Black women writing nonfiction was a gap that we identified, where we felt that what we regularly see is Black women writers who write nonfiction writing memoirs or being pushed in a specific direction where they're writing only about race. And again, this limiting aspect of Black writing when it is in a predominantly white infrastructure institution. Publishing, we're growing in the continent, but it still works by global Western norms, and is just operating within that white space on the whole. So we launched a few initiatives to actively encourage that growth from a grassroots perspective. So we ran a workshop for Black women, African women on the continent who are writing nonfiction to write essays. And because we wanted them to have a clear output and to work towards something, we had them write essays on the theme of taboo, which will then be published in an anthology coming out later this year. And because we have to think in terms of that wider infrastructure, so it's not just the writers on the continent, but are they being edited, where they're being published? We also ran an editorial workshop for African women editors on the continent who could then edit those essays, and then they'll now have edited essays that will be published. So I think the way we envision those schemes is to have a actionable output to the end, have something these people can put on their resumes or their CVs, a proof of concept, that will allow, hopefully, now these editors that we've trained to go forth, work with magazines like Lolway, work with institutions, and have more Black women who are editing the Black writers. Because I think that's also almost as important as the writers, having that institution and the people behind the scenes working on these books. And then our final initiative was a global Black Women's Nonfiction Manuscript Prize, which was publishing unpublished manuscripts of Black women writing nonfiction, again on those wider themes, not just memoirs, but speaking on critical ideas around the world. And then those 3 winners we will then be publishing by Exile Republic next year. So again, trying to really tie these initiatives to outputs and actively build towards that archive.
Awesome. I like that idea of archiving, because in the end, it's that when you look back on history, what is there to see? If you don't document, it's as if nothing, we're just living in a blank world, as if nothing was quite happening. So that idea of archiving, is quite critical, and the role that literature plays in doing that, so that one day some people will not wake up and say, oh, because it wasn't written, they didn't have a history, or because it wasn't written, that didn't happen, or this didn't happen. Oyindamola and Troy, I'll come to you now specifically about MFAs and creative writing schemes and things like that are usually like the traditional routes through which writers get nurtured. The 2 of you have gone through this in different forms. It may not be the popular ones are the MFAs, but I would like you to speak specifically to that in a way that, okay, if young writers don't go through the MFAs, are they missing anything? And what are and you've somehow mentioned it, what are the pathways to actually nurturing their talents? Typically people will say, oh, to be a writer, just write. But you are in the field, not just as writers, but as people who are actually who create and nurture these spaces where writers thrive. So I would like you to speak from your experience. Okay, without MFAs, what exactly do writers need to be doing?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anyone will die if they don't get an MFA. That's like the first place I always start from. Toni Morrison says, the talent cannot be taught, so there's so many writers on the continent, on the African continent, who are already so talented. You can tell, at Lolway we receive about 1,000 submissions every open cycle, and we can tell writers who, someone is 17, 18, and you can already see that, the work shines. But I suppose sometimes what these MFAs do, and this is what it did to me, is kind of almost open a second door in your brain so that you can see things in a way that you wouldn't have seen them. You will know why you make certain choices. You kind of become very intentional about your storytelling. And I think that's kind of what's missing in the African literature scene right now. You have so many people who they have the talent, but either because they do not read enough, because number one, books are not as accessible as, in Europe or in America or somewhere like that. Number two, our schools, and as someone who went through school in Kenya, they do not really emphasize the importance of actually looking at a text and seeing, why is this text the way it is? So we are not taught that kind of the critical side of looking at literature. And that's part of why there's very little literary criticism coming out of the continent, because and I suppose, I don't know how different it is to Nigeria, but like in Kenya, we are not taught how to look at text and kind of take it apart and put it together and be like, okay, this is why this text functions this way. This is why this text doesn't function this way. So when I was setting up Lolway Academy, the idea was, how do we create a space where a writer like Zukisu Havana, who's been doing this for years, a writer like Maaza Mengiste, who's been shortlisted for the Booker and stuff like that, how do we bring a writer like that to meet that writer living in northern Nigeria, or living in Kenya, or living in South Africa, who, yes, they know this is the kind of story I want to tell, and these are the building blocks I have. How do I put this block on top of each other until I have a full house? And kind of that's how I think of MFAs. You know, we all have the raw material, the raw materials for writing, but sometimes we do not know which raw material to pair with which one. And so if you meet someone who's done it, you know, and you know, Spring NG does this very well with their mentorship, where someone may have not studied the work formally, but because they've done it over and over again and they've made their own mistakes and they've learned from that, they can kind of come to you and say, hey, instead of you having to make all these same mistakes I had to make and going through all the same rejections I had to go through, this is how you do it. It's kind of like learning cooking from your grandmother. There's no recipe book written down, but you know, she's oversalted the food, she's undersalted the food until she knows exactly, you know, and that's kind of the difference between mentorship and actually learning. When you learn, you probably are learning from someone who has, you know, written down a recipe and all of that. But when you're going through mentorship, you're going through someone who has instinctively done it over and over and has made mistakes and kind of is like, okay, cool, this is not how to do it, this is how to do it. I think it's very important, number one, for the community aspect of it. It provides a comradeship kind of thing for writers. You know, when writers come into Lolwe Academy and they spend maybe 12 weeks together, there's kind of a vulnerability that develops in the workshop. There's a vulnerability that develops in someone seeing your work when it's not finished. There's a vulnerability in someone being like, oh, hey, I know you're trying to do this, but if you try this, you know, and so people develop a sense of community. People see that they are not alone in their perhaps misunderstanding of punctuation, because, you know, a lot of us assume everyone knows punctuation. I am an editor and I've been an editor and I have an MA, but there are certain punctuation marks I still struggle with. I'm like, oh, I have to check this, you know. And so when they come into spaces like the Spring NG workshop and the Cassava Republic workshop and the Lolwe Academy, they kind of develop that sense of, oh, I am not alone in this. And so it kind of it signals to a wider vulnerability that then they lean into. And that almost helps the work become better, because they learn that there's always something to aspire to. There's always an excellence to aspire to. And that's kind of how I look at it. And it is something so beautiful, and it is something I tell more African writers to lean into. I still, whenever I see an opportunity for a workshop to learn, you know, I apply for it. You know, I don't think, well, I've been shortlisted for this and I've won this. No. If someone who I admire and someone who I think, oh, this is someone whose literary journey I'd like to follow is teaching a workshop today, I will apply for it. I do not have that ego of like, oh, I'm at the pinnacle of my work. And so I always tell people when they come into my workshop, lay that ego aside. It doesn't matter if you've been published. It doesn't matter if you haven't been published. We're all here to help each other out, and we're all here to hold a mirror to each other and say, hey, you've tried this, it's not working. How do we do this way? And I really like when that happens within the workshop setting.
Thank you so much, Troy, because you've nailed the issues on the head. Aside the issue of handholding someone who has gone through the experience, there is also, of course, the challenge of creativity itself and being in that community. You can, this is one way to go about it. This is a new way to approach it. And you can also say that, oh, I'm not alone. We are all in this. So this writer that has been shortlisted for this award, that has done this and done that, also has similar challenges to, you know, so it's quite interesting. Oyedamola, do you want to chip in?
Yes, sure. So I've pursued an MFA program and I've gotten the degree. Now, before I pursued the MFA program, I was a writer for like 8+ years, just writing and doing a couple of other things. And I'll mention some of the things I did, then talk about the importance of the MFA program outside all the things I independently did. So of course, write. That's the basic. If you want to be a good writer, keep on writing. You can't edit a blank page, but you can edit something. You can edit a badly written piece. Read widely. Read the things that don't interest you. Read bad books so you know not to write a bad book. Read good books. Read interesting books that align with your interest. Publish your work in various places because it helps with credibility and it helps to build an audience. Then volunteer where you can. Not everything is about money. Money is important, but not everything is about money. Leadership, and work experience also matters. A lot of us started these organizations because we didn't see organizations doing what we want for writers. So if you see a problem that writers are facing within your community, this is an opportunity for you to start something new. You can also pursue work experience like editorial work experience, or maybe reviewing pieces for context. I worked as a book reviewer for like 3 or 4 years for different organizations. I also owned a blog where I used to publish book reviews. Peer reviews also matters, so get criticism from peers, learn how to give criticism. Apply for contests and awards, it helps build credibility. And then mentorship and fellowship matters because it helps you understand what writing is like within a community of other writers. It's a different experience compared to writing alone and like writing in isolation. Then community participation matters, so attend literary events. My introvert self never did a lot of that, and I wish I did. So attend a lot of events because you get to learn from experts and you get to network and you get to see what someone else is doing that you may not have done. And then I will say publishing, learn a lot about publishing because publishing is not just releasing a book. Publishing is sales, publishing is marketing, it's photography, it's learning how to manage social media, learning how to manage a website. So those are all the things that I did before pursuing an MFA. Now, when I pursued an MFA, I was like, dang, I wouldn't have suffered for 8 years if I got to do an MFA first, because an MFA encompasses all these things in very manageable ways and in a way that wouldn't cost you as much compared to when you're trying to do it independently. I didn't get to pursue creative writing. I wanted to study creative writing even for my bachelor's degree. But of course, if you come from Africa and you have African parents, there are some unserious things you can't go to school to spend your parents' money on. And so like I kept delaying it. And when I pursued the MFA, I was like, this is exactly what I needed all this while. It encompassed all the things that I had tried to do independently. And when you try to do a lot of these things independently, the journey may also be harder in the sense that when you encounter so many failures from rejections, like if you don't know how to edit your work, for example, don't know how to get feedback to edit your work and you keep submitting, imagine submitting to like 25 platforms and getting rejected from all of it. So it discourages you along the way. But when you pursue an MFA, you get the editorial support. You're able to strategically submit your works to literary platforms that align with your interest, and then you get a higher acceptance rate. There are several opportunities we've created under Spring relating to that. So for example, our website has a Spring Lit page that lists over 500 literary websites, and we verified all these websites. We verified these websites every year, and that list keeps growing. It's under our publication session. So if you're ever stuck on where should I start from, I think that's a good place to start by challenging yourself once every week to submit your work somewhere.
Thank you so much for that. The two of you mentioned something that I found kind of critical. But you approached it from different angles. It's about book reviews. It was interesting that Oyindamola mentioned read books, review books, and I want you all to talk a little bit, and I can start from Leila to talk about the role that book reviews or the role that critical reviews play in building institutions or in the creative space generally.
Okay, thank you. I just want to quickly jump on the MFA conversation. So I think I was really struck by talk about how there aren't hardly any institutions exist on the continent. And I think what having MFAs does also add to the ecosystem of writing, in the sense that we need to be brutally honest in that writers don't make money. Most writers always have second jobs, and with MFAs and opportunities to teach writing, that's a lot of ways in which writers can actually have writing as an income and see it as a way of life, and kind of address those concerns that all our African parents have about this not being a viable career path. So I think when you have spaces that see writing as a viable career path and as something worth valuing, then you have MFAs spring up and you have these opportunities and people really nurturing that ecosystem financially as well as through creative opportunities. And then I think speaking on reviews, so as Kasara Republic, for us to exist, we rely on word of mouth and on people learning about our books and hearing it and supporting African writers. And there's a lot of times where I'm based in London, I have conversations with people who say, I'm not aware of African literature, I've never heard of these books, because they're exposure is coming from this limited mainstream. And we know as a Black publishing company that mainstream is not necessarily very welcoming to things that are outside that norm. So we've had experiences where we've talked to literary editors at newspapers, and they've said, well, your books are a bit too niche for us, because they have a sense of what their reader looks like, which is somebody white living in the middle of England. And they don't think that, although our books are clearly universal and anybody who reads them could understand them, they see white books as universal and Black books as being niche. So we try to really go directly to the community, appeal to readers directly through social media, through connecting with people like who have these book blogs like Erin Doman used to have, to bookstagrammers and book talkers, and really encouraging those people to share the book, spread that word. And that's how you can support these institutions to continue to exist. So I think we try to get across to readers as much as possible. Again, publishing, these aren't places that make a lot of money, that they require lots of passion to run. And if people want to see these institutions continue to exist, engaging with these books critically, sharing ideas, promoting word of mouth is all the ways to make that happen.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. Looking back on the years, sometimes I also think that when you write book reviews, or when you say you read a book you didn't quite like and you want to write a review, when you understand what it took that author to write that otherwise terrible book, you will approach the review with some sort of grace, with some sort of kindness. This is quite personal, because going back when I was much younger, I once wrote a review of, this was the writer's first poetry anthology. And these were the days when Next Newspapers was new, and I used to do book reviews for them. And I wrote the review, and my editor was like, no, you don't do that. That was how I learned kindness, because I felt, this woman should just have stuck to writing her short stories and her novels. This poetry thing isn't working. But with the help of the editor, we're able to find a way to communicate the thoughts in a way that wasn't damaging, yet added value. So it's sometimes about finding the balance. Next set of questions would be
just on that point.
Yeah.
I'll say I think there is a conflation between criticism and critique. So a lot of times now people are too scared to engage with the book critically because it will be seen as being just criticism. I think authors sometimes respond to that. So it seems a lot of trepidation about how to engage with the book critically. But I think the most respect you can give is to do a thoughtful critique of a book where you acknowledge the issues if they can. So I hope people will be less scared. Again, I think because African writing and Black books seem more niche, people are scared to criticize them because you're thinking you're hurting opportunities. But hopefully we get to space people, there are enough books around and people respect them enough that we can have healthy critique.
Healthy. I think the word is healthy. Like you even if you don't like something so much, you can still approach it with. And there's a particular reviewer that does that. Like you finish reading the review and you're like, she didn't think highly of the book, but the author would still thank her for the review.
And I also think, sorry to cut in, but I also think when people understand all the elements of storytelling, then they're able to be good reviewers, because a book might fail on the plot, but the language is really good. A book might fail on style, but the dialogue is really good. And so when you engage with the work critically while understanding all the building blocks of storytelling, then you're able to kind of say, hey, this book worked on this, but it did not work on this. And this is how I think the writer should have, engaged with this and this and this. But for most people, they think, as Leila has pointed out, they think to critique and to criticize are the same thing. And so that's why we kind of end up with all these people who they get one lens and they subject every single book to that one lens. So if it's poverty porn, that's all they look for in a book. But a book might nuance poverty in a way that another book didn't. That doesn't mean it's poverty porn. It just means it's reflecting the reality of these people. A book might look at something like child soldiers. There was a time when so many books that were coming out of the African continent were about child soldiers. But not all of those books are bad. Some of them are mirroring the realities that we experience on the continent. And so as a good literary critic, and it took me having to go through a literary criticism class for a semester to realize that, you know, you do not just engage with a book as a unit. You kind of break it apart and you look at what are the things that work and why do they work, and what are the things that do not work and why do they not work, and that becomes then a wholesome review. But obviously within the continent as well, because our industry is so small, people are scared sometimes of, you know, writing bad reviews or something like that. I do not read any reviews of my work, good or bad. I do not engage with it because I always feel like once I've done the work speaks for itself. You know, I kind of I come from the school of death of the author. Once I write something, that's it. You know, I'll speak on it on panels and stuff like that, but I do not engage with reviews because they will not change the book. As a writer, reading reviews, you've already written the book. So you'd rather read something that will help you develop for your next book. But reading hurtful reviews of your current book will not really change anything, to be honest. So yeah, that's kind of how I normally look at it.
Thank you so much. I want you, Oyindamola and Troy, to take a step back and go back to those years before you had anything published and think through the collaborations that have sort of gotten you to where you are now. What was it like finding such collaborations, and how has that, you've somehow mentioned it in different ways, and how has that been for you?
I could go first on this one. Yeah. So this is where I'll also out myself. I don't follow what I do, follow what I say. I'm not someone that is very dedicated to publishing my works like individual pieces on multiple websites. I've done a few here and there. Because I'm very intentional about what I write and what I say, especially because it's writing. It's very specific. You choose the words that you decide should go out there for the world to see. And so it takes me a while to like write what I think I want to put on the platform that should be read elsewhere. So if I'm going back to those times, I didn't do a lot of that. However, I can speak from the perspective of Spring in terms of collaboration and even Poetry Journal. When I first started Spring, co-founded Spring in 2016 with Coinsola, we were doing just the basic programs like publication of pieces, book giveaways, and all that stuff. But as our programs grew into the fellowship, and the Spring Writing Fellowship isn't the only one we've had, we've also had an advancement fellowship that helps people prepare for MFA applications. As our programs grew, we realized the need for collaboration because you can't do a lot of things alone. There's this saying that if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go with others. We started to reach out within our network to collaborate with literary platforms that were specific or geared towards a certain country's demographics. So for example, for the Spring Writing Fellowship, the year we wanted to expand to Ghana, we collaborated with CGWS Contemporary Ghanaian Writers Series. The year we wanted to expand to South Africa, we collaborated with Botsotso. The year we wanted to expand to Liberia, we collaborated with Pepper Coast Lit. And our collaboration is not just plastering a name on the website. Our collaboration is an intensive process whereby they get to learn about our program and share the resources to promote the program application and talk to people within their community and people within their space about the benefits of the program to inspire them to apply. For Poetry Journal, on the other hand, Poetry Journal is primarily publications, and we started last year, 2024. Well, 2023, but the first issue came out 2024. Poetry Journal was founded by Tolu Akinyemi, aka Poet Tolu. You may have seen him on Instagram. Last year, for our first issue, we didn't do a lot of collaboration in quotes, but then for this, our second issue, when I was more invested on board, one of the things we did was collaborate with over 20 other literary platforms to help spread the word about our previous issue and our platform. And this led us to have, I think it was over 500 submissions from, I think, over 400 writers. And I can't overemphasize the importance of collaboration because you think you're doing well alone until you find that one person who can push you up a little bit higher or show you a different direction, a different perspective that you haven't thought of. So collaboration has helped a lot in all the projects that I've done, writing wise, especially projects that are relative to serving others.
I agree with Oyindamola about the importance of collaboration. You cannot underestimate how important collaboration is, especially in a space like African literature, where we are all, in as much as you can think, as big as you can think you are in the African literary space, we are all really, really tiny. Like, you can be the biggest in Nigeria, but in the grand scale of things, you're really tiny. You can be the biggest. Even Lolwe is really tiny in the grand scheme of things. And so I always say, people like Remi Ngamije from Namibia who runs Duke, I got published in his magazine and he got published in my magazine, and we both got shortlisted for the Kane Prize for that. This was like the first time something like that was happening, where both an editor of the platform and was being on the shortlist and stuff like that. And so, I think of people like Zukiso Vanna, who we've collaborated on, be it through the Afrolit Sans Frontiers Festival and stuff like that. And I think what always disheartens me is I get so many emails about people asking to collaborate with the Lolwe, for example. And I always say, before you send out a collaboration email, please read through that email and think, if I was to receive this email, will it actually be a collaboration? Because if you send me an email and you say, hey, we'd like to collaborate, and this collaboration is you publish my work, I'm like, okay, but where is the collaboration? It's a very one-way, and so many people send, and I'm sure Oyindamola has experienced this, Leila, you've experienced this, where so many people just throw in the word collaboration, and the idea is, how can I benefit from this? And so for me, I always analyze, whenever I receive an email, I always look at it and I'm like, okay, is this something that's going to strengthen this person that's emailing me, and also strengthen Lolwe as a platform, or strengthen Troy Onyango as a writer? Because I have that dual function of, I also, do my own writing and then I run this platform. So sometimes when people email me and I look at that, I'm like, this is not really a collaboration. And it can be disheartening, especially when you want to work with other spaces, but they don't really understand how their values or their strategies align with yours. You have to think about, how does the work I'm doing align with this other person? Just the fact that we are all in the literary space doesn't mean our goals align. Remi and I have been trying, we've been friends, core friends, for like 6 years now. Our platforms are around the same age. We do almost everything similar, but every year we brainstorm on how can we work together, and it always fails, just because he has a direction he wants to take the magazine, I have a direction I want to take mine, and it can be a bit frustrating, but we give it time. We say, okay, you know what, every year we come up with ideas, we test them, and then we see which one is standing the test of time. If they all fail, that's it. It doesn't take away from our friendship. It doesn't take away from the respect we have for each other's platforms. It just means these particular set of ideas do not align with where we want to take our platforms, because we just do not look at collaboration as an immediate thing. We look at it in terms of the impact 5 years from now, 10 years from now. Is this something that we are going to look back at? And a few years ago, someone approached us and say, hey, if you two can work together on a prize, on a literary prize, we'll be able to fund that. And I was like, okay, I want the money. And we both really wanted the money. But we looked at it and we were like, no, we function very differently. He's very focused on growing Namibian literature. He's very much focused on, operating in a context where there has been no literary magazine before. Whereas I'm very much focused on, how do I push beyond the boundaries of the African continent? I'm looking at the Caribbean. I'm looking at the Black diaspora. My vision is more outwards, whereas his vision is more inward. And sometimes that just means our visions cannot align, even though we share a very beautiful friendship and we respect each other's work so much and we respect each other's platform. So yes, we always need to keep interrogating the partnerships and the collaborations. And if someone does not respond to an email or does not say or says, oh, this collaboration does not work, please don't stop trying. You can check if you come up with another idea, just throw it back at them and see what sticks. Eventually something comes up. There's someone who I had been talking to for almost a decade about a collaboration. And next year is the first time this collaboration is going to work. And we've tested ideas over the years. And next year is the first time we've actually seen something that we are like, oh, for 2026, we want to do this together. We want to do, and he wanted to do it in 2024. But I was like, no, Lolwe has to survive 5 years before I can do certain things. And this year, Lolwe is 5 years old. So now I'm like, okay, cool. And I messaged him and I was like, hey, do you still want to do this? And he was like, yes, I've been waiting for this. And so you see, that's like a decade in the work. So you can, sometimes we look at things and we think, well, Oyindamola came up with the fellowship, last week. No, some of these ideas are like 5-10 years in the making. And that's kind of always what we need to look at. We need to look at the bigger picture when looking at these collaborations.
Wow. Thank you so much for that behind the scenes view into what it takes. I liked the way you spoke about not just thinking about what to take from other people, but exactly sit down and ask yourself, what am I also giving? If it's supposed to be collaborative, it's supposed to be like a two-way street. You're not just taking, you're also giving, which is also the idea about nourishing. You are taking, you're also giving back. And this is what it is for many individuals, many institutions, organizations in the African literary ecosystem. I usually say it's a labor of love. Anytime you see someone doing stuff in the African literary ecosystem, just give them a pat on the back or, squeeze some money into their hands.
Money.
Also, I would like to go to a debate that has been had several times on the continent around the place of government as an institution in nurturing the literary ecosystem or not. Because some people are like, if you take money from government, you jeopardize the quality of work. It also means that you cannot criticize that government. I want to hear what everyone thinks and about what role the government can play, if at all, in nourishing the literary ecosystem. And even if they do play that role, are there ways to sort of put checks in place to ensure that literature remains literature and doesn't become propaganda?
One thing I'll speak quickly to is I remember speaking to one of the participants in the workshop we had last year, who's from Zimbabwe, and she talked about how because of the taxes on books and because they don't have a library system, she runs the Harare Book Club. She has to get her books in through South Africa because it's cheaper that way to get them brought into the country as opposed to buying directly in Zimbabwe. So I think things like not having taxes on books, I think a society that taxes books has shown that that's not something that they value inherently. And then also this lack of libraries and places where people can actually access reading at a free level, fundamentally encouraging that growth from a very early age, are ways in which you can have that kind of hands-off government intervention, but supporting the industry as a whole, the ecosystem and the culture of reading and writing, and showing them to be things that are valued by the government. Just my initial thoughts on that.
Thank you so much, Leila. Oyindamola.
Yeah, I could add to that. I think a lot of us are creating these organizations and opportunities because we have a government that has failed us in that aspect. Because if, let's say, there were schools that had MFA programs or that had specific creative writing programs in their undergrad, like the chances that I would have created Spring is very small. If there were so many literary opportunities sponsored by the government, contests, awards, etc. And I'm not just talking about giving like one big humongous prize to one person, spreading it across it, which is more people. There are so many opportunities that we wouldn't individually create. And then the second thing to think of is a lot of these organizations that we've created are self-funded. A lot of us don't have government funding or other like sponsors from elsewhere to give us the money to run it. I remember like when we first started Spring and we started adding board members, the board members had to jump on financially. When our program started to grow towards the direction of requiring money to run it, there are times when I had to work 2-3 jobs, sometimes simultaneously, to make sure there was money to run the programs. And people don't see the back end of this. They just see the glorious thing that Spring is. They don't see the hard work that the people that have to financially support our programs have to put in there. So I think the role of the government is to provide these opportunities. They are not excused. Just because we have this program still existing, because people are individually interested in creating it, doesn't mean they're excused from giving the resources, at least, or establishing the necessary institutions or programs that need to exist for writers to thrive. When I think of African countries and Nigeria, for example, in comparison to the US, and the kind of institutional supports that exist is far wide. And I'll give you an example. When we're towards the point of registering Spring, I think when we're about our 6 years mark, we first wanted to register it in Nigeria and we started the process for it. And then we had the conversation after like doing the name registration that if we register it in Nigeria, what are the opportunities that tie to this registration? And when we did like the math and looked at the resources, it was literally little to none. And last year, 2024, we registered Spring in the US, in Maryland. And end of last year, we got a grant to support our professional development part of what we do. End of last year, we also got partnership with Masterclass to provide our fellows and mentors for this 2025 with access, 1 year access, membership access to their platform, to gain additional resources and learn while they're doing their individual work as writers. So the government is not absolved from their responsibilities. They need to step up to do more. Our representatives in different places need to step up to do more. If they can't do the work, there are existing programs with evidence of success like us that they can delegate the responsibilities to, especially with financial support, to do the work well to serve our writers.
Thank you so much, Troy.
I mean, I've always believed that the government intentionally, deprive African literature of resources because they know what it means to have a population that is literary aware, a population that reads, a population that can engage with literature at a higher level. We've seen our writers, Ngugi wa Thiong'o and, Wole Soyinka, jailed and imprisoned and all that stuff. So I am one of those people who believe they know the work we are doing and they know where they can step in. They have Ministry for Arts and whatever, but they all focus on WizKid and Burna Boy and, they know so well literature exists as part of the arts, all our countries have Ministry of Arts and Culture or something like that, but you will never see them anywhere close to literature. And yet all these people went through school and all these people read literature, so they know what literature is. You cannot even disguise and say, oh, well, maybe they fell out from space and they didn't know what, they don't know the work of Soyinka and they don't know the work of Achebe and they don't know the work of Chimamanda and all those people. So I've given up asking for government support. All I'm always asking for is if they cannot support us, then they need to remove the punitive measures. So the taxes, they need to be able to say, well, we are not going to subsidize the book, but we are also not going to put taxes on it. So you find a way to get it into the country, and then that's it. That's all you need. But over and over again, whenever people have turned to the government, they either find a way to incorporate you into their propaganda machinery. And so you have writers who are now speech writers for presidents, and you have writers who have now been incorporated into writing campaign ads and stuff like that. And then that talent is lost, because at that point you no longer have that independence to critique or to criticize that government. You no longer have the independence to publish what you want as a literary platform, because people will be like, but if this same government is paying you, then how are you able to? And so I always feel like there needs to be a buffer zone. And so in England, for example, you have the Arts Council, which acts as a buffer zone. So the government does the money, the Arts Council distributes the money. And so there's always like a layer of protection, which doesn't really exist in Kenya, and probably Nigeria, So when you deal with the government, you're dealing directly with the Ministry of Arts. Whereas if all our countries had, arts councils or art organizations that were funded by the government, and then those art councils, which will probably be run by, people who work in the arts, then that will be a buffer zone between us and the government. And so until such institutions are established, especially for me within Kenya, I do not want money from the Kenyan government. I really do not, because they will have to co-opt us into their work. So it's hard getting funding, especially on the on the African continent for literature. First of all the billionaires are all believing in STEM and saying everyone should have an engineering degree and all of that. But nobody needs any more engineering degrees. Like, they're still giving that work to China anyway. So you will get your engineering degree and they'll give the work to China. So why do you need an engineering degree? So it's a very frustrating point, especially for Lolwe, especially for me. But over and over again, I refuse to engage with the Kenyan government in terms of funding. There are other institutions and there are alternatives that we've shown that can be done. They're still very young and we can still build on them. And, if partnerships with like Masterclass and stuff like that are helpful to us more than partnerships with the Nigerian government, then we need to pursue more of those and leave the Nigerian government to support whatever they want to support, or the Kenyan government support whatever they want to support.
Thank you so much for that. It's a sobering conversation. And I think one of the critical elements missing in the African literary industry would be the challenge of distribution. The challenge, I always say, anybody who succeeds at fixing book distribution on the continent, I don't even know. It's a big challenge, but also comes across as, oh, this is potential for a successful business. But I'd like to pack that aside for a bit and talk more about the publishing industry and finding the balance between supporting creative talent and making a profit. Because in the end, yes, while all of this is a labor of love, business has to survive, at least run day to day. Yes, they may not be grand schemes, making big profits to share, but for something to have the impact that it wants to have, it needs to survive. Initially, during my days in publishing, it was always, we don't publish poetry because many people don't buy poetry books. We don't publish plays for the same purpose, while also, I can understand. So I would like you guys to talk about how you find that balance between nurturing creative talent and not just existing, but thriving. Leila.
I don't know if I would say anybody in the publishing industry is thriving. We're surviving though. Anytime we talk to other small presses, kind of, so how are you surviving this year? It's always kind of the same conversation over and over again. But we always say that the one responsibility we have to our authors is to stay solvent, so we keep their books in print, and that we have to take that at top of mind. I think authors might have other expectations, but ultimately that's what it comes down to, is that we need to be able to survive and keep these books available. The good thing about being a small press is that we don't necessarily always think bottom line first. So we publish lots of literary fiction. Literary fiction is never going to be a big seller, but it's something that we're passionate about, and it's these writings that we know might not get published elsewhere, but these voices are powerful and important. So we'll always make space for those, even though our sales team might say, that's not the most commercially wise decision to publish. But then we do have to balance that with these financial concerns. So one thing we're doing actually is we used to have a romance imprint called Ankara Press, which we're going to be relaunching next year as a commercial imprint of Kazan Republic. So we'll be doing romance, we'll be doing more women's fiction, more commercial non-fiction across that imprint, which I think still aligns with our mission at Kazan Republic to kind of showcase that diversity of African and Black voices in writing. but also that will hopefully allow us to continue doing what we're doing under our Sun Republic name, which is publishing these more out there writings, these more maybe considered niche nonfiction, literary fiction that might not take off, but still needs to be added to that archive that I mentioned earlier. So it is something that we constantly have to consider. And that's why we're also looking for funding is also so important. So last year we were able to run this nonfiction women's manuscript prize, where we were able to give the winner $20,000 and the two runners up $5,000 by having this external funding, because we know that nonfiction writing for Black women, is something you have to take time out, so you have to do research. We want to be able to remunerate the writers as well as we can, but it's not something we can necessarily do as a small press easily. So trying to find these pockets of money and this funding and these collaborations wherever we can to continue thriving and or attempting to thrive and continue to exist so that these writers can have these opportunities.
I'd like to jump in here from the writer's perspective. So in my early years of pursuing my writing outside of the school things I was supposed to be doing, I was interning at different book publishing companies. And one of the things I realized was because of the focus of profits, and this were book publishing companies here, because of the focus of profits, some publishers would select books that would make sales more than creative books. And as someone who worked as an editorial intern, there was a point whereby I was the first reader of emails and submissions that would come in, and then pass it on to my supervisor to say, hey, this is what I think you can prioritize. And I remember one specific book that came through by a Nigerian author, very brilliant book. The imprint said they could not see themselves publishing it or marketing it. They passed it around multiple other imprints in that publishing house. All of them said the same thing. They could not see it the way they would market it. And I kept on thinking to myself that, like, as a Nigerian, seeing the work, I was like, this is one of the, like, this seems easier to market to me. Like the way the author wrote the book too, because she had like a very diverse background. I was like, this seems like something that would be easier to market to me than some of the books that these people have actually pushed out and successfully and made successful. And so it was from that moment that I realized that, and that was one of the things that discouraged me from submitting my works for publications to publishers, because I realized that if in your proposal you somehow cannot justify how your book is going to make them money, the chances that they're really going to pay attention to you is a little bit lower. And then as a poet, I suffer at the lower end of it. My book, my most recent book, Face Me, I Face You, came out August of last year. I skipped the process of having to run around to publishers to submit my works because I am tired of hearing the people are not buying poetry book, and the book is evidence of that. The success it had within less than 6 months is evidence of that, because I keep asking, what are these people you're selling books to that are not reading poetry? And second, what are the type of poetry? Because poetry is very vast and is very wide. You can't pigeonhole us to just one perspective. And people have this perspective that poetry is this Shakespearean thing, difficult to read and difficult to understand. Contemporary poetry, for a huge part, is also marketable and is also many of them are commercial reads. And so I skipped that process and just went straight to a publisher that I already knew to ask if they would be willing to publish the book, and they were very supportive. So I think there is a lot that needs to be changed. First, in the perspective of supporting creative work and sometimes prioritizing that over publishing. And we also need to, over publishing for profit rather. And then we also need to understand that publishers can do better in finding readers and connecting with a community of readers for the books that they release out there. And then the third thing is we should stop pigeonholing journals to say that poetry, for example, is not sellable. And then the last thing I want to say is it's not a fair statement sometimes to make to say certain books cannot sell when you've not made the books affordable. Many of the readers in African countries are young people in schools. If I'm getting a 25,000 naira monthly, what they call it, stipend, do you think I'm going to spend 10,000 naira on a book? Yes, if the book is worth it, I'll starve. But the chances that I would want to spend over half of what I'm already managing on a book is lesser. So when you want people to read books, you need to find ways to make the book affordable to people. And sometimes the hiking of the price, I understand the printing cost, having worked in publishing and all that stuff, the cost to release book, I understand that. But I also see areas whereby the prices of books are hiked just for profitability. And there are so many people that would have otherwise read that book if it was just a little bit more affordable to them. When I released my recent book, Face Me, I Face You, that was one of the things I was intentional with when I was talking to my publisher, that the book is not going past a certain price because I want people to be able to read it. I know the experience of not being able to buy books because I couldn't afford it. And I don't want other people to feel that way. So there are so many things we could think about when we're thinking of profit and publishing, but I would hope more publishers keep that in mind in their approach to working with authors and also engaging the readers that they want to get the books they've released out there.
I'll say this is a bit unfair to authors, but if you're being realistic about the theatre industry, this is why I do encourage authors to have that platform and that social media profile, and just because it's another argument in your pocket to say, well, I do have a following, I do have this audience that will help publishers consider you. Because while we should ultimately be thinking about what is creative, what's good, those factors will never disappear, that profitability that we're within a capitalist infrastructure society. So having showing what you can as an author of, this is the effort I'm willing to go through for my book. I think you see that a lot with self-published writers, who are the ones thriving sometimes the most because they're treating it like a business and have that business mindset. I think lots of authors are, well, I'm a creative, that's kind of what I've done. But increasingly, the way the industry is changing, readers really like to have that connection with the author, and author marketing as well, because people buy the books more than publishers a lot of the time. So I just think in terms of like nurturing and advice for authors, it is trying to grow a platform, show your commitment, show that you want that book to succeed, and you're willing to do what you can as a writer as well. And I definitely agree with you about the pricing. It is very tough from the publishing perspective because the margins of publishing are so tiny, where if people think publishing houses are kind of hoarding this money, but you're barely making any money from the cost of the books. And then especially with, I know in Nigeria, we have the struggle of how to get the pricing right because we print in the UK for quality reasons, but then the cost of the book then has to be priced up when we send to Nigeria just to make any kind of profit from it. So it's very complicated, and it's been getting worse since the pandemic and shipping, and there's all these external factors that come into pricing. So and so where something like a government not having tax on books and things like that would be an act of support for the industry as a whole.
All I'll say is the publishing industry, for the most part, is a very passive industry. Like, it's one of the most passive industries. Every year they wait for an independent press to take a risk, and if that risk pays off, then they all try to replicate that. So if that year, Romantasy or something is published by like an independent press, and then that sells, then all the Penguin Random Houses and everyone is rushing into everyone's mailbox and DMs and being like, hey, can you churn us out Romantasy in the next 6 weeks? And they tell writers this. I've received these emails where I've been told, hey, can you write a book on BLM and we'll publish it in the summer? And I'm like, I don't even write on race. Like, I'm a new immigrant in this country. Why would I write on race? And I've received those emails and I've received those messages. And so as a writer, you have to decide what kind of writer you want to be and what your definition of success is to you. Yes, some people want to sell 1 million copies. Yes, some people just want to be read. Yes, but it boils down to you as a writer, and that's how you choose your publisher. If you are a writer who aspires to sell, I mean, everyone wants to sell 1 million copies, obviously. But if you're a writer for whom that is like your primary priority, where you're like, if I don't sell 1 million copies, I will not be able to live with myself, then leave the independent presses alone. Like, don't go to the independent press and then try to pressure them to sell 1 million copies. Rupi Kaur published, Milk and Honey and sold over 1 million copies before any publisher even touched it, And so you see things like that. And then when she was like, okay, now I'm tired of printing this book by myself, she had like a 16-way auction bid or something like that. Like, you can see how publishers are just like, we want a template that's already finished so that we can just churn it out. And so when we look at, the African continent, and I think we need to look more to what India did, where India was like, we're going to step away from this Western model of publishing and just create our own model of publishing. And so when I was in India the other day, they were like, number one, we don't produce hardbacks because who is buying hardbacks? Like if you are selling in a market like Africa, you try to print the book, you try to bring the book into paperback as fast as possible. As someone who owns a bookshop, I know there's so many people who want to read a book, but because it's in hardback, they cannot buy it, they cannot afford it. And so I'm always telling people, if you're publishing for the African market, number one, look for the mass trade paperback or whatever paperback that is cheapest while you can still maintain the quality where, you know, it's not blotted paper where you can see the text on the other side, but at the same time, it's not Queen Elizabeth type of paper. Like I don't get why people insist, especially for books by African writers, which are being sold on the African continent, to be on hardback. Nobody's going to buy a book for 20 pounds. Nobody's going to buy a book for 18 pounds if they have to choose between eating and buying a book. And so publishers need to realize that, yes, you can produce a book. Let's say you're based in the UK. You can produce a book for the UK market and follow the whatever rules they have where you produce a hardback for a year and then after that you produce a paperback. But the same publisher can decide for the African market, because this writer is based in Africa or this writer has ties to Africa and I need them to sell there, I'm going to produce this mass, you know, go to China and produce 10,000 copies of that book and just dump it into the African market. And that's how you're going to make your money. If you can produce a book that you can sell in Nigeria for less than 5,000 naira, if you can produce a book that you can sell in Kenya for less than 1,500 shillings, you will sell so many copies of that book. At that point, people will not even worry about, oh, is the book good or bad? No. It's about, is the book available? And so many publishers lose out on really good books because they keep insisting that this book has to be in hardback. And no one reads it, so no one knows it's good, you know. But if you produce a book that almost half the population can access easily, you know, when Chimamanda published, I think it was Half of a Yellow Sun, that book was everywhere on the streets of Nigeria because it was produced in this paperback that, yes, the type font was really tiny and we all had to squint to read it, but you could find that book anywhere in Kenya. You went to the streets, the people who sell books by the roadside, and you could find that. And I think those are some of the models we need to look at. India does that a lot with their books, where I went to India and my suitcase was packed because for the first time, books were cheaper there than anywhere I'd ever been. And it's because they print there locally. And this is also something I always tell people. We can fix the distribution problem if we don't believe that books have to be physically shipped. Why don't you partner with Masobe Books and say, hey, I'm releasing this book by a Kenyan writer. Here is a PDF file of the finished thing, email it, print it locally there. You do not need to be sending books via DHL from South Africa to, no, send a file over the internet, encrypted file, let it be printed there. That's what they did with my book. That's how my book became widely available in territories that I've never even been to, because I told my publisher, listen, there's no reason for Tuke to send books physically from Nigeria to Kenya. Jahazi Press is here. Why don't you send the finished files in an encrypted format to Jahazi Press with a password that only they can access? They print it here, then send that same file to Pivapo Press in South Africa in an encrypted format. And so wherever I go, I look at a locally available publisher and I tell them, hey, the files are ready. All you have to do is print. And that means at that point, you do not even need a publisher sometimes. You just need a printer. You just need someone who knows how to print books. And that then becomes a way, because we've seen Jumia and all these Amazon replicants fail in Africa, which means that's not a business model that can work on that continent. So why do we keep trying to do something that we all know is not going to work when we live in a digital age where you can share files, you can send books, you know, electronically, they get printed as long as it's a safe method and all of that. And so sometimes I think we get stuck on Western models of publishing. And so we think that it also has to work in Africa. And so when that fails, then we become frustrated, whereas we can actually step out and build our own models. Heinemann in the 60s used to transport books, you know, using the tomato sellers going across the borders. We are not doing that now. Like, books were being better distributed on the continent in the 60s and in the 70s than they're being distributed now. Doesn't that blow your mind? Like, like in the 70s, you could easily access African literature anywhere in Africa than you can access it now. That's just not how it's meant to work. And that's because they did not discriminate. As long as you are going across the border, they'd give you a carton of books, get it to a bookshop nearest to you, and that's it. They did not think, oh, this has to go via DHL or this has to go via whatever courier we kind of think. And so, sorry for the long-winded answer, but I get really frustrated when people think that all these models are set in stone. The UK and the US developed models that work for them. There's no point for us transplanting those models and bringing them to the continent. I realized that print magazine doesn't work successfully in Africa. I decided to keep Lolwe online. Whenever I do limited print issues, those are for the US and the UK market because I can easily post something door to door and I know it will arrive. But even at home, my parents don't have a physical address. They have a house, and we all know it's the house behind the tree near the school. But we need to think about those models before we try to replicate them for the African continent. Thank you.
Wow.
I think you can also touch briefly when you're talking about encrypted files. So piracy is also a major issue that we have to contend with. So that's also part of what factors into the pricing decisions that publishers have to make, where you're losing a lot of money from books being available so much cheaper through piracy. So then there's a balancing act that publishers do when it comes to pricing, which is kind of how can I make any money back from this when I'm also dealing with these challenges. So it is a very complicated and tough situation, but that was really a lot of great ideas. So thank you.
That's true. Thank you so much. Troy talking just reminded me of an experiment that happened during my uni days. I had a group of friends who, I don't know, we figured books were not, for instance, I studied literature and most of the books I read were photocopies. And he liaised with publishers and would get books to different university students across universities. And well, we read the books, made a small cut of them, and books were available in universities. And it's interesting that he runs a chain of bookstores in Nigeria now. That's Dotun Oyade. And, you know, this has been something from way back. I would like to speak somehow about the flip side of things with reference to collaborations. And on the flip side of things globally, when it comes to profit making, some publishers look to publishing stories by celebrities who already have their following, who are sure that their fans will buy the books. I've not seen much of that translating on the continent. If that were to work on the continent, what do you think that would look like? Because there are maybe not even celebrities, there are say content creators, there are people who have like a ready market to tap into. If that happens, what would that mean for the creative industry as a whole?
That was part of my criticism of the publishing space in the US. Because again, the priority is profitability. I also think the problem with that is for those who study, for those who study writing to become experts of it and to gain mastery of it, there are less books that are written with the intention of understanding the craft and more books that are written just for profitability. There are, I remember reading one book that was categorized under poetry for a publisher that I had worked for and thinking, gosh, did this person even try? But of course, this person was famous, this person had the platform, etc. What I usually recommend to writers, which I think was Leila that mentioned, what I usually recommend to writers is that before you go into publishing, there are so many things that you need to learn. Learn how to start a website, build your newsletter list, learn how to run ads, build your social media following. It increases engagement and it gives you evidence that your book or your content is marketable. One of the things I did with my own book, Face Me, I Face You, before releasing it was for about a year, I was posting pieces of poems that were similar to what was inside the book. And that was what made me realize people were actually interested in that kind of poetry. And that helped me guide me even to realize what I should cut out, what I should leave in the book. So doing things like that as a writer allows you to take some part of responsibility and making sure that if at all you want to submit your work to a publisher, you've built or established a relationship with a potential audience that can make the book marketable. I don't think we'll ever have a world whereby book publications by celebrity will be an absolute thing that won't happen. I feel like I've not seen a lot of that in the African literary space as much as I have seen in the US market. But I hope it doesn't go that direction. I hope the direction that the publishing space in Africa is taking is to include more writers and more creatives who are primarily focused on the craft, and especially those who studied it. So yeah, that's what I'll have to say to that.
I mean, I'm looking at it from the other side, where if a publishing house needs to make money to publish these other good writers, then, this is where publishing houses have imprints. So if a publishing house needs to publish, who is the biggest seller? Someone like Davido or Burna Boy, if a publishing house needs to put out something like that to be able to sustain them publishing, very literary writers, then they just need to establish 2 imprints, and one imprint will be the literary side and the other one will be the commercial nonfiction, because there is a market for this. And it's very funny because sometimes people read those things and then they look at the publishing house and then it guides them to the other books. So sometimes it works really weirdly in a different way. But also, yes, I'm one of those people who I read very serious literature, but sometimes I just want some gossipy, something that, this week I've been watching Young, Famous and African on Netflix, and it's things like that which we also need to cultivate into our literature, where on one hand, we need, yes, these hardcore books. And I really like how Masobe sometimes, they'll publish the Nearly All Men in Lagos Are Mad, stuff like that, that will make sales for them, that will actually be like, and then they'll publish someone like me who, I'm not Nigerian, I'm very literary, I will probably not sell, more than 1,000 copies in Nigeria, but they look at the balance of things. And so if all I would normally say is if a publishing house is keen on doing something like that, and I want more celebrity memoirs from Africa, there's a lot that is interesting in their lives that we kind of don't have access to, we don't have insight to in the way that Americans do, just because we do not have a big celebrity culture in Africa. People think we do, but we really do not. If you look at the way Americans relate with their celebrities, where they know everything about these people. And so for me, I think it's that balance. Would I personally do it? No, but there is a space for it there. I think there's always just the power in recognizing that something is just not for me, but there's something it's serving in the market. There's a power, it sustains something else in the market. So I would encourage more publishing houses to do something like that, and cookbooks, stuff like that, children's books, they generate so much money, so much revenue. I mean, the Penguin Random Houses, we think they're built by, their Booker Prize winners. No, they're built by the David Attenborough, memoirs and the Spice Girl memoirs, because that's what, they release. I mean, Harry's memoir alone sold enough to sustain a literary industry. When the Obamas released their memoirs, those sold enough to sustain a whole publishing house for a full year. So we always need to look at those, especially like the presidents. I think the best-selling book in Nigeria last year was by a woman who is a politician and is like a whistleblower or something like that. And that book sold way more copies than any fiction book published, including Ayobami Adebayo's A Spell of Good Things, which was longlisted for the book and stuff like that. So I think there just needs to be that balance where we do not lean too much on one side. And then there's space for all of them. As long as people are reading, more people are reading.
I also just want to quickly add that, yes, we should have multiple imprints that focus on different things. But I also think it's important to note that we should not over-resource one more than the other. The level of investment provided to publishing that's commercial publishing and things that are so-called marketable is different from the level of investment. The first time I came across a publishing deal and saw our publishers negotiated a good book by a so-called good author, I was like, dang, so there is money in this thing. Publishers are willing to invest and take the risk for books that they think they can make profit on. The amount of money they would invest in poetry is so small, and they wouldn't even put as much marketing effort in it. I've seen the marketing plan for a book that was under like a commercial, the commercial category and made more available to or accessible to the public compared to the marketing plan for a collection of poems. And I was looking at it side by side, and I was thinking to myself, this isn't fair. So if you want something to thrive, also be willing to at least make the attempts. Do it for a couple of times until you figure it out. I know it's never going to be perfect, and I know the switch won't flip all of a sudden. It may not generate interest all of a sudden, but you have to do it a couple of times until you master it. But we will never know if publishers aren't trying to put the same level of investment in those other genres or other categories of books that are seemingly not profitable to them.
I think Troy mentioned this earlier, but the ones you'll see like putting that investment, taking that risk is these smaller indie presses. But then what will happen is once they've kind of published and gotten that surprise hit, usually those authors will then move on to a bigger publishing house, and then kind of history will repeat itself where you kind of become a pipeline. And then the ones who are taking the risks aren't necessarily making the money to sustain them. I think part of it is actually, I was on a panel last year talking about this, whether there's responsibility for authors who leave their smaller publishing houses, and everyone's being very understanding of the authors. But I think there was a point where it would be great if authors and publishers could grow together. And that's something, unfortunately, we don't see a lot. But I think that would be a really great way to allow people who are doing more experimental, that literally that more side of things, to grow a consistent audience, to have the money to then put back into that marketing. Because if you start only a few books that make that much money, then you don't have the money to make that investment, even if you wanted to. I know we always wish we could do more for any of our books than we can do. And we have to handpick the few that we think these are our lead titles, and that's what we can put more investment behind. And it's calculated choice, because if you try to spread it thin, then you might have none of your books taking off at all. So like I said, the responsibility is to stay solvent and stay viable. And then separately, so I think I mentioned before, we are trying to do what Troy mentioned, just having a separate, more commercial imprint where we can hopefully get better sales there and then continue doing what we're doing at Examen Republic. And in terms of influencers, so I don't think we're going to go with big celebrities, but we are looking towards influencers, because they have an audience, and I'm a recovering literary snob. Clearly, these people have something they want to say, people are interested in reading it, and those books also have a value and need to exist. So trying to find a way that you can do that without compromising your values, because obviously we've seen things like that Brooklyn Beckham book where they're clearly putting out the celebrity books that they haven't edited at all, and are really, so I think at least show that I have respect for that part of the industry, put that effort into editorially, make sure there's people saying interesting things. And also it's a great way to discover new writers, because I know when I'm looking to commission, if somebody's not putting those out there online, I don't know they exist. So I think this is a topic that I'm really interested in a book about. I would need to go online and search and find people who are doing that. One way to do that is the academic space, but academic writers, the challenge there is getting them to write for a commercial audience. So that's something we also try to do with nonfiction is, I want to poach this person from the academy, but then will they write in a way that people want to read their book? Whereas with people who are just writing blogs or social media influencers, they already know how to talk about these deeper topics in a very engaging and accessible way. And I think there is a real interest in that. They might not be classically trained, they might not have these MFAs. But then also the downside with MFAs is that I found sometimes people come off too samey, where they've kind of gone through the same experiences and they have a specific voice that comes out of writing an MFA. So I think there needs a balance of finding people who really study the craft and could do that, and then finding people who are just more raw. And then that's where, as an editor, I come in, and why we want to train more editors. And how can we then work with these people who may not have gone through this training, who may not understand the works, but they have a voice and they have an idea that needs to be shared. And then as a responsibility as publishers, I should put that effort. I know with bigger presses, they want the most polished thing they can. They're churning out hundreds of books a year. There's so they're working quickly. Whereas as a smaller press, one benefit we have is we take our time. So we will acquire a book where I think editorially this is very raw, it needs a lot of work, but it's either a story that is told or a voice that's really important. And then we will take our time, put that editorial. So similar to what ONW is, rather than not necessarily the marketing spend we're putting in, but we're putting a lot of investment editorially and time-wise into making these books as much success as we think they can be.
Thank you so much, Leila. Oyindamola says she has to run. So I just want to say thank you so much for joining us today and sharing so freely about the amazing work that Spring is doing. And I wish you all the best going forward. Would still love to have you here, but if you have to run, we understand. The last question is around AI, artificial intelligence, how writers use them, and what the future looks like for the writing space with reference to artificial intelligence. Who wants to build the cat?
I could go first and then up off if you don't mind. I'm
Right.
sorry, Troy. Okay. So I think this is controversial, partially because AI is still fairly new. I think 50 years from now, the conversation will be different about AI. I will say where the line is drawn is the ethical boundaries that many organizations haven't clarified or how I put it, haven't clarified or said something about. So I can talk about it from the writing perspective. I remember coming across a piece that someone had submitted for one of the platforms that I was working with. This person literally picked the works of the previous winners, put it in AI, and asked AI to create one poem that he can submit for it. Now, being well read, I think from the organization and the organizer's perspective, what helps is being well read enough to be able to spot this. We didn't even need to read twice to be able to know that's what this person did. So I think from the organization's perspective, it helps to be clear by creating policies or statements to say, this is our stance on AI as of now. When we know better, we'll put up something better for you to understand how we hope our writers or how we hope our organization would interact with AI. Many organizations in the US, especially nonprofits, are now being required to have AI policies to even get grants. So I think organizations are responsible for doing that. Now, from the writing perspective, we all know what's ethical and what's not ethical. There may not be a rule book to say don't do this or do this with AI, but I hope more writers will lean to the ethical side and also understand that AI is putting out information to you based on what already exists. And so to go into AI and just not do some work, like not do some work before trying to use it, will lead you into a lot of trouble. And then AI is not fully accurate yet. And you know when you register, even on platforms like ChatGPT, it will tell you that like some of the information may be wrong and you need to go back to verify. Yes, it's a useful tool. It's a useful collaborative item to help amplify writing for things like editing, proofreading, or even getting summaries. But don't lean on it in a way that absolves you from your own responsibilities as a writer. And then AI, there is something that we said during my MFA program. The conclusion we came about when we're talking about AI is that AI doesn't have the soul that you as a writer has. You will know something that has been written by an independent, by a writer or by a person compared to something that is written by AI. So that's what I will say about the use of AI in the space. It is an opportunity that more organizations and individuals and writers can lean into, but we need to be clear on our stance by creating policies. And also as individuals, we need to just lean more on the moral and ethical side in our use of AI. I will jump off air, but thank you so much. It has been a pleasure speaking with you, Temitayo, Leila, and Troy, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
I think there's kind of a few separations. There's a conflation between kind of generative AI and AI in general as well, which gets muddied a lot these days. So I think AI tools behind the scenes that can like make things work, potentially there's space to they're not going to go away. We've been using things that are basically AI for years, but there's been a branding change. I think where things that were called software before are now being acknowledged as AI. So I think it's still early enough that we haven't gotten these clear delineations between the two. But in terms of generative AI, I think even beyond there's the clearer ethical conversation that people aren't having enough about things like the climate change impacts of it and the way it's being trained by poorly paid people across the continent. I think inherently my first concern is those infrastructural ethical concerns. rather than, let's say, how it's going to impact the industry in terms of is it ethical to publish a book that's AI? So I think as a topic as amongst our ethical framework, I think using something that's trained in that way that has the impact would go against what we believe in that regard. Separate to the conversation then about truly publishing writing that's not human generated as AI generated, the plagiarism aspect, all those factors. I think people kind of use the crutch of it's not very well now, it doesn't work well now, but it's going to work better and these things will be more indistinguishable. So it is something that, like Deborah said, we have to develop frameworks and policies for as quick as we can. I know that I'm seeing crop up more and more in contracts is authors saying, you know, I won't have an AI generator cover, and they're very clear on that and they include that. And I know recently there was an AI only publishing imprint that opened up that they got like 16 million, a crazy amount of money in funding, and they're going to flood the market with their AI books. But I think there's always going to be people written books, and that's not going to change because people want to write rather than even go to reading events. More than people who love books, I always end up coming across like 5 or 10 new people who want to write as well. So I think the urge to create creatively is never going to change. What's unfair and maybe damaging is that these are industries that I've said before don't make much money financially. And what's the financial impact going to be on writers when they're competing now with even more books out that might affect pricing? So I think those are kind of the ethical concerns that I consider more and more. And I've heard people asking me about whether you think it will work in editorial. Personally, I have no interest in using AI as an editorial helpful tool. I don't know how it could because I see a book through my lens and that's what I bring to the table as an editor. So having AI kind of go through and give a summary of the book isn't going to help me because my lens of how I see the book is different to what an AI might do. So for myself as an editor, I really hope people don't start relying on its editorial tool because I think that changes the relationship between an author and an editor and what the role of an editor is, and the unique value that each editor brings to their work. So that's kind of it's a bit chaotic, but those are the kind of things pinging through my head as I think of the word AI and the publishing industry.
Yeah, I mean, I agree fully with what Leila and Oyindamola have said. I think, you know, AI is here to stay. We do not know yet where it's going to take us. It's developing too fast. Some of us have had to adapt with it, you know, at work. In my 9 to 5, we've had to, you know, switch fully over and, you know, use it more often. And then in my creative work, I cannot use it at all. And so it's kind of just having to, you know, get your brain to get used to the fact that this is creative work, you cannot use this, and this is your 9 to 5, you can use this. But it's also one of those things where, you know, if you decide to fight it, it's a fight you're going to lose. If you decide to embrace it, you don't know where it will take you. And so for me, I think as an organization, it's just been how do we protect ourselves, you know, and, you know, I updated our contracts to reflect something like this. And we insist that the work has to be original. While we try to figure it out, we are limiting what we are open to submissions for, just because we want to go back into our academy of people who we already know their work, we are familiar with, we can have comparisons and stuff like that. And so it's just been a question of how do we safeguard ourselves as an organization while we wait for the other people, the engineers and the, you know, the tech people to figure it out for us. I use it for like my daily stuff, like, oh, plan a trip, blah, 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 blah. But I have no intention of using it in my creative work. I think the creative work has always been something that relies on texture, and that's something that generative AI still cannot achieve. You know, there's emotions, there's a way you write about things that, you know, AI cannot still achieve that. And so for now, we are still ahead, but we don't know for how long as writers. But at the same time, it's not something to worry about. I'm sure just the same way we adjusted to the internet, the same way we adjusted to computers, the same way we adjusted, we as a human race, we will always adjust and stay ahead of these things. So, you know, as a writer, you decide what tools you can get out of it that are useful for your work without you crossing the boundaries, but also at the same time, be curious about the world and be curious about things while still maintaining the integrity of your creative work. Because at the end of the day, what matters in your work is the integrity of the work. And once that is lost, once that credibility, if people know this is a writer we cannot rely on to produce original work, they will not commission you, they will not publish you and stuff like that. It's just like plagiarism, you should never plagiarize anyone's work. And so with AI as well, if you think, well, my credibility will be on the line here, ask yourself, is this something you want to lose very easily? As a writer, you take so many years to build your credibility. Your readers come to you because of your credibility. They come to a Troy Onyango short story because they know there's an element of credibility that they're coming to get. And so if Troy Onyango then turns to out to not be the person who's written that, then the credibility is lost. And so even if you've spent 20 years building that credibility, you can lose it in a very short time. So yeah, I just think, on one hand, let's all stay curious and let's see where it goes. But on the other hand, let's also draw boundaries and alongside around what we kind of want this AI thing to be.
Yeah, there's been a very rapid kind of preparation it's used that I feel seems unsustainable, where everyone's kind of using it for every little task, and people are, I'm not gonna write my own emails anymore. In my phone's suggesting that I use AI to write text message responses. So I think there's a point where it'll balance out, where now it's this new shiny toy that everyone's jumping into the both feet first. So hopefully we get to a more reasonable balance in a little while as well.
Thank you so much for your responses. And it's interesting that as the whole world is trying to navigate AI use, it's like an extra thing that writers now have to deal with. But I want you to speak to writers navigating challenges in the creative writing space. What advice will you give such people as a takeaway as we close out? What's your advice? And I know you've dropped this here and there as we through this conversation, but specifically as we sign out, what would you say to young writers? What Troy said, everyone is a writer, to writers navigating the creative space.
It's one of our writers this year is a 60-year-old debut writer. So like Troy said, we don't need to focus on just the young ones. I think my advice, definitely writing in itself is a very solitary act, but publishing is an industry and writing is a bigger community and ecosystem. So that if you are serious about writing, then you need to go out of that bubble. A lot of writers are introverts, but you need to make those connections, be curious, submit widely to things, use platforms like Lolway and these literary magazines that are cropping up more and more on the continent to build your profile, to get that critical feedback early on, so that when you do go to a publisher, you're familiar with the process, that you've treated it. I think a lot of times you get writers, first-time writers, who have a very romantic sense of what publishing will be and being a writer. So I try to not be too harsh when you need a bit of a wake-up call. So I think having that curiosity amongst the business side of the industry, doing your research, talking to other writers, going to events like Onyendu said, and meeting people who are involved is really key, because I think there's a lot of information out there, but it's very scattered and chaotic. Something that we are very aware of at Kasara Republic, and we do want to provide more resources online and more. We've done publishing workshops in places before, but look for that information. It is out there, and then I think really, read a lot, grow your craft. It doesn't necessarily have to be MFA. If those aren't available, you can learn a lot just by joining writing groups and getting that feedback early on, so that when you're not kind of blown away when an editor comes back with really hard criticism, because you've trained that habit and you've got that kind of shell. I think writers are very inherently sensitive. Writing feels very personal. It's your baby, something you created. So just hardening that shell and being more and more comfortable with getting critique, with being open with your work and not keeping it just to yourself.
Yeah, I think I agree with Leila. My one advice is always to read. Just read more than you write. Read the writers that came before you. Read the writers that are writing at the same time as you. Stay curious, find your community, and just write. At the end of the day, you call yourself a writer because you write. So just write. If you're going to call yourself a writer and you're not writing, then you're not a writer. You're something else. We don't know what that is, but you're not a writer. So as long as you're writing, figure out your routine. If you're a morning person, you're a night person, whichever time, just keep writing. And don't get so hung up on, publishing and prizes. Those things, they all have different, so much more that goes into it beyond your work just being good. There's so many considerations that can sometimes go into the selection of work for publication beyond just, oh, this is the merit of the work. And so when you get that rejection, don't think it's a rejection of you. Think it's a rejection of that specific piece by that specific magazine or that by that specific publishing house. And then just, water off a duck's back, shrug it off, move on to the next place. Always find a way to improve your work, find a way to grow as a writer. As you grow as a person, also grow in your curiosity as a writer. And that's just it.
Thank you so much, Leila, Troy. It's been such an amazing time listening to you all and learning more about different ways to continue to support creativity on the continent. And thank you, Canex, for making this conversation happen. We have come to the end of the session today. Over to you, Osas.
Thank you to Tayo, and thank you, Canex.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being part of today's session. It has been a very, very impactful and practical session. So everybody has offered very valuable perspectives on how we can better support writers across Africa. And I just want to say a very big thank you from all of us at Canex. And to our panelists, we deeply appreciate your expertise and the actionable insights and time you have spent here while sharing these insights. And to our moderator as well, thank you so much for steering this conversation so seamlessly. We hope we can carry forward the lessons from today as we work toward creating a stronger foundation. So thank you, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much.